dust swirled across the busy streets of Lagos as dawn stretched its golden fingers over the skyline, painting the tall glass towers in fire. A convoy of sleek cars cut through the traffic, black-tinted SUVs gliding like shadows guarding a single white Rolls-Royce at the center. Inside that Rolls-Royce sat Chief Adele, one of the wealthiest men in West Africa, a man whose empire spanned oil, technology, and luxury estates from Victoria Island to Abuja. He wore a crisp white agbada threaded with gold, a matching cap perched neatly on his head, and yet beneath all the splendor was a restless soul weighed down by suspicion. He had everything but trust, for wealth had brought him flatterers and gold diggers who smiled with their lips while their eyes tallied his bank balance. His father once warned him with a Yoruba proverb, "The river that forgets its source will dry up." Adele forgot nothing, but he often wondered if he had dried up inside. That morning, as his convoy slowed near Broad Street, fate wrote a script no boardroom deal could alter. His car suddenly jolted, engine coughing like a dying man, and within seconds, the Rolls-Royce rolled to a dead halt in the middle of the road. Horns blared, drivers cursed, and his bodyguard scrambled, confused. A hush fell inside the car. Adele's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, though he wasn't driving. "Sir, please remain calm," one guard muttered, already pulling out his phone to call for another vehicle. But the humiliation pricked at Adele's pride like a thorn. To be stranded, here, in front of common pedestrians, it felt like an omen. Passers-by slowed to gape at the billionaire's helpless car. And then, from the crowd, she emerged. A young woman, barefoot, her steps light yet determined, her clothes plain but neat. Her name was Ifeoma, though none of them knew it yet. In her left hand, she clutched a worn folder, its edges dog-eared, containing her CV and certificates. She had walked miles from a small one-room apartment in Mushin to get here because she could not afford transport fare. Her only pair of shoes had snapped 2 streets back, but she did not turn home. She slid the broken sandals in her bag, squared her shoulders, and continued barefoot, her soles blackened by dust, but her spirit unbent. She too was heading for the skyscraper ahead, Kado Holdings Tower, where interviews for an assistant role were scheduled that morning. She had prayed all night, whispering to her late mother's framed photo, asking for strength, asking for a chance. And now, without warning, her path collided with the most powerful man she had ever seen. Guards moved to block her as she approached the stalled Rolls-Royce, but she lifted her chin and spoke in a voice calm, yet carrying an authority no one expected from a barefoot girl on the roadside. "Excuse me, sir," she called, eyes fixed on Adele through the open window. "Your engine hasn't failed. The belt is loose. If you keep forcing it, you'll burn the system." The guard scoffed, one barking, "Move along. Do you know who you're speaking to?" Laughter rose from the crowd. Who was this poor barefoot woman daring to instruct a billionaire? Adele's eyes, sharp as razors, studied her. Pride swelled in him, wounded by the absurdity, but something in her steady gaze unsettled him. He leaned out and said coldly, "And you? What makes you think you know better than engineers trained abroad?" Ifeoma swallowed, her folder clutched tighter. "Because I fixed the same problem for my uncle's Peugeot last month. You'll call an expensive mechanic who will tell you the same thing only after wasting your time. But if you want to reach your tower meeting today, loosen the casing, reset the belt, and the car will breathe again." Gasps rippled through the bystanders. Her confidence sounded like arrogance to some, like prophecy to others. Adele's mouth curved in disdain. "A barefoot girl wants to teach me about engines. Do you even have credentials?" He waved her away. "Go, before my guards remove you." But even as he dismissed her, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him, for the girl's words carried not desperation, but precision. Ifeoma bowed her head slightly. "I am on my way to your building, sir, for an interview. Perhaps after I fail, you may remember that truth can wear dust, not diamonds." She turned, ready to leave, and the crowd buzzed louder. Adele's pride wrestled with practicality. He snapped his fingers. One guard lifted the hood and tinkered. Minutes passed. Then, exactly as she said, the belt adjustment roared life back into the Rolls-Royce. Silence fell. The billionaire's jaw clenched.
He had been schooled before strangers by a barefoot woman. The guards looked away, embarrassed. The crowd murmured with new respect. Adele's eyes found Ifeoma's back as she walked barefoot towards the glass tower, her folder hugged to her chest, not once looking behind her. Something in his chest shifted. The morning had begun with his pride on display, but now a mystery walked ahead of him. A poor woman with nothing but truth in her mouth and dust on her feet, leaving behind a billionaire who could not laugh anymore.
The lobby of Cato Holdings Tower gleamed like a palace of glass and steel, its marble floors reflecting chandeliers that sparkled like frozen lightning. And as Ifeoma stepped barefoot into that temple of wealth, every polished shoe seemed to pause mid-step, every painted eye lingering with disbelief. For what kind of woman came to a corporate interview without shoes, clutching a dog-eared folder instead of a designer handbag? Yet she held her head high, her gaze steady, and she walked past whispers that floated like sharp knives. Who allowed her in? Is she lost? This is Cato Holdings, not a charity. But Ifeoma, daughter of a seamstress who had died stitching clothes for others, remembered her mother's words. "Child, the palm tree that stands tall does not beg the grass for space. It claims its sky." So she claimed hers, one step at a time, until she reached the front desk, where a receptionist with scarlet lipstick looked her up and down, eyes narrowing at the sight of her bare feet, before softening reluctantly when Ifeoma produced the printed invitation email, crumpled at the corners but still legible. And the receptionist, sensing something unusual in this girl's quiet defiance, gave a clipped nod and slid a visitor badge across the counter. When Ifeoma pinned it to her blouse, she felt the weight of dignity heavier than gold jewelry. Then followed the receptionist's instructions toward the waiting area, where 4 other candidates sat already, their leather briefcases lined neatly like soldiers, their perfume thick, their laughter dripping with practiced charm. And as she approached, silence rippled. A man in a navy suit smirked, adjusting his Rolex, whispering to the woman beside him who chuckled behind manicured fingers. Another candidate with glasses cleared his throat, as if her presence somehow lowered the oxygen. But Ifeoma ignored them, lowering herself gracefully onto the far seat, smoothing her skirt, and arranging her folder on her lap as if it were the crown jewels, though the only treasures inside were photocopies and dreams. The room smelled of cologne, printer ink, and ambition, but Ifeoma carried the scent of earth and resilience, the faint dust of Lagos streets clinging to her feet. And in that contrast lay a story none of them could yet read. Across from her, one man rehearsed interview answers under his breath, muttering about supply chains and stakeholder synergies like incantations, while the woman with the manicure scrolled Instagram, flashing a new designer purse to her followers with the caption, "Wish me luck." But Ifeoma bowed her head and whispered a silent prayer, not for luck, but for clarity, that her mind would not betray her under the weight of stares. Soon Grace, the HR officer in her navy skirt suit, stepped into the room with a clipboard and a professional smile, her voice ringing clear. "Good morning, candidates. Thank you for coming. We will begin with a group case before proceeding to individual interviews. Please follow me." And like a flock, the others rose, clicking heels and polished soles tapping the floor in rhythm, while Ifeoma rose barefoot, her steps soundless yet strong. And as they walked toward the boardroom, they did not know that behind them another figure entered the lobby quietly, unannounced, no entourage trailing him, just a man in a simple white shirt whose presence bent the air itself. Chief Adewale Cato, billionaire founder of the company, had chosen today, of all days, to observe the interviews personally, still unsettled from the roadside encounter where his Rolls-Royce braved again under the prophecy of a barefoot girl, and though he had not admitted it aloud, he had followed to see if coincidence would reveal itself as fate. His eyes scanned the waiting area, then locked on the girl in the plain blouse, walking calmly beside candidates in designer clothes, and recognition flared. It was her, The same barefoot woman who had spoken truth against his pride just an hour ago, now carrying nothing but a folder into his tower, as if dust itself had been invited to stand among diamonds. And for the first time in many years, Adewale felt something stir in his chest. Not amusement, not irritation, but curiosity wrapped in humility, because this girl had dared correct him without fear, and now dared to step into his house without shoes, as if destiny itself had written her name on the day's schedule. The other candidates did not know who walked behind them, but Grace did, her posture stiffening as she caught sight of her employer, and she whispered, "Sir," but Adewale raised a finger to his lips, silently commanding discretion, for he did not want the candidates to know they were being weighed not only by HR and finance, but by the very man whose empire they dreamed to join. As they entered the boardroom, with leather chairs and a long oak table polished to a mirror shine, Ifeoma took the last seat on the edge, quiet, folding her hands on her folder while others spread out pens and tablets. And Adewale stood near the window, silent, watching, his mind replaying her words on the street. Truth can wear dust, not diamonds.
The boardroom felt like a battlefield disguised in polished wood and glass, its wide windows spilling daylight over the table where 6 candidates sat in a crescent, each with sharpened ambition gleaming in their eyes, and at the head of the room stood Grace, clipboard in hand, her professional smile hiding nerves, for she knew her employer was watching silently from the window, his presence cloaked in simplicity, yet heavier than any crown. "Your task," Grace began, sliding printed briefs across the table, "is to design an operational plan for mobile medical outreach across 3 states, limited vans, harsh roads, and a tight budget. 30 minutes to present your plan as a group." The candidates grabbed their copies, pens flying, whispers colliding like blades. But Ifeoma opened hers slowly, her brow knitting with the focus of someone who had lived the problem rather than studied it. The words on the page painting not theory, but memories of carrying medicine through flooded alleys for a sick neighbor, of calculating borrowed transport fare against the weight of cassava on her head. A man in a navy suit spoke first, voice slick as oil. "We outsource logistics, hire private contractors." "Done," he said, waving his pen like a baton, while another candidate countered with a dramatic proposal about using drones to drop vaccines in remote villages, earning chuckles and nods from his peers. But Ifeoma's voice cut through, calm and unpolished yet certain. "Drones cannot land where there is no space, and contractors eat money faster than a fire eats dry grass. The poor will still wait by the roadside," she said, drawing startled glances, some mocking, some intrigued. And though her bare feet brushed the cold marble floor beneath the table, her words carried the weight of iron. She leaned forward, pointing at the brief. "Roads in Kogi wash out by afternoon rain, so the vans must move by dawn, and each site needs a backup partner within 15 kilometers in case of breakdown. We must also rely on trusted local voices, pastors, teachers, market leaders, because people listen to faces they know, not posters on walls." And as she spoke, her pencil drew maps of clusters and loops on the margin of her paper, lines like rivers flowing with reason, her plan weaving both efficiency and humanity, while the others fumbled with buzzwords and PowerPoint visions that had never touched dust. Across the room, Adewale's eyes sharpened, for her words carried the rhythm of memory, not theory, and he recalled the Yoruba proverb his father once thundered, "The child who knows the path, even barefoot, leads the elders home." Grace scribbled furiously on her clipboard, though she tried to keep her face unreadable, while the man in glasses scoffed, "Where is your data? How do you know queues form at midday and not morning?" And Ifeoma lifted her gaze, steady, "Because mothers fetch water at dawn before they carry babies to clinics. That is their rhythm, not your theory." And the room grew still, because even those who dismissed her recognized the clarity of lived truth. Still, pride resisted, and the woman with the manicure muttered, "She speaks like she runs this company already." But Ifeoma ignored the jab,
keeping her eyes on the plan, her pencil circling the word redundancy like a drumbeat of survival. Minutes bled into 20, the group fractured into subplots, suits arguing over budget allocations, polished voices debating optics. Yet slowly, almost against their will, they found themselves orbiting her map, her loops, her modest but stubborn logic, until their presentation, delivered haltingly by the navy-suited man, carried more of her handwriting than their jargon. And though her name was never mentioned, the oak table bore witness. When time was called, Grace collected the plans, her eyes flicking toward Adewale, who had not moved from the window, his arms folded, but his mind ablaze. He had watched her on the roadside, watched her again here, and the consistency unsettled him, for people often bent when faced with wealth. Yet this girl, barefoot and unknown, bent to no one but the truth she lived. As the candidates shuffled papers and whispered final rehearsals, Adewale's voice, deep and controlled, broke the silence for the first time. "What if the vans fail completely?" he asked. And all eyes spun toward him, jaws dropping as recognition rippled. This was not some silent observer. This was the chief himself, the billionaire whose name crowned the tower. And panic flashed across faces like lightning, each scrambling for polished answers. But Ifeoma spoke before the others could hide behind jargon. "Then we walk, sir, with coolers on our heads if we must, because medicine that waits for comfort is medicine that kills." And in that instant, the room froze, her words naked, raw, unembellished. Yet they rang like a bell, echoing against glass walls until silence swallowed the boardroom whole. And Adewale, for the first time in many years, felt his guarded heart stirred not by wealth, not by flattery, but by the truth spoken from dust.
The corridor outside the boardroom buzzed like a hive when the group case ended, candidates whispering sharp judgments, their voices dripping with envy and calculation. For though no one said it outright, all had seen how the barefoot girl's map and calm voice had tilted the balance of the discussion, and that truth made some uneasy, others resentful. Ifeoma, however, felt only the sweat cooling on her neck and the weight of her folder still in her lap, her mind replaying every word she had spoken, wondering if boldness had been courage or folly. But she forced herself to breathe steadily, remembering her late mother's counsel. The lizard that jumped from the high iroko tree said he would praise himself if no one else did. So she carried herself with quiet dignity, her bare feet padding silently across marble while others clicked in imported shoes. Soon Grace reappeared, clipboard clutched tight, her eyes sweeping the group with professional detachment, though she could not help a glance at Adewale, still shadowing the process with the patience of a hunter observing prey, his white shirt plain, but his aura heavy. And she announced, "We will proceed with individual interviews, one by one. Finance and operations will join me. Please wait here until called." And with that, the polished candidate with the Rolex straightened his tie, adjusting his lapels with rehearsed confidence as his name was called first, striding into the interview room with a grin like a billboard, leaving the rest to sit in uneasy silence. Ifeoma sat at the far end of the couch, smoothing her skirt again, eyes down but ears wide, catching fragments of whispered strategy, the manicured woman practicing sound bites about global outlook, the glasses man muttering about capital allocation. And though their words spun in circles, Ifeoma thought of the market women in Onitsha who made profits with no spreadsheets, only memory and trust. And she wondered if the panel would value reality over rhetoric. The minutes dragged like hours, each candidate emerging with brittle smiles, some forced, some triumphant, their eyes darting at Adewale, who gave no hint of judgment, only watching, listening, absorbing like a riverbed. When finally Grace called Ifeoma Unwokoye, the air shifted, Every head turned and the whispers fell into silence, for curiosity had become suspense. The barefoot girl whose words had cut through theory was now to stand alone before the panel. And as she rose, folder pressed to her chest, she heard one man mutter, "Let's see how far dust walks without shoes." But she did not flinch, instead whispering a proverb under her breath. The tortoise moves slowly, but he reaches the farm with his shell intact. And she stepped into the interview room. Inside, the air smelled of polish and power. 3 glasses of water sat untouched, and at the far end of the table, Grace waited with her clipboard. Beside her, Mr. Okonkwo from finance, with rimless glasses and a reputation for shredding dreams with questions. And at the center, not hiding now, sat Adewale himself, his eyes fixed on her with a curiosity that made her pulse leap. For here was the man whose Rolls-Royce had betrayed him, whose pride she had pierced, whose silence weighed like thunder. And she bowed slightly, murmuring, "Good morning, sirs, madame," her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "Please sit," Grace said, her tone clipped but not unkind, and Ifeoma lowered herself into the chair, her folder on the table, her bare feet curling against the cool floor, as if drawing strength from it. The first questions came sharp. Finance demanded figures, projections, margins, and Ifeoma answered with clarity, citing her small cooperative work, how she cut transport costs by negotiating shared trucks, how she measured attendance with chalk tallies, how she reduced spoilage by rotating stock through neighboring stalls, her examples humble but precise, and though Okonkwo's frown deepened as if unimpressed, he scribbled furiously, for her answers had numbers, not slogans. Grace leaned forward. Why should we consider someone with no corporate background, no polished resume? And Ifeoma breathed deep. Because sometimes the river that knows the stones carries the boat better than one that only reads the map. And her voice did not shake. Silence followed, and then Adewale spoke, low and deliberate. "And what if we say no? What happens to you tomorrow?" And her eyes lifted to his, steady despite the storm in her chest. "Then I will go back to the market, sir, sell ground nuts until my hands ache, save for another pair of shoes, and try again, because rejection does not erase ability, it only delays recognition." And in that moment, Adewale felt the marble floor tilt beneath his pride, for the barefoot girl spoke not with desperation, but with truth wrapped in resilience. And though the panel had more questions, though the clock ticked past its measure, it was that answer that lingered, that pierced, that turned the interview from an examination into a revelation.
The hallway outside the interview chamber had grown restless by the time Ifeoma stepped out, her face calm though her heart still thundered from the weight of questions, and the candidates waiting turned to measure her expression like gamblers reading dice, but she offered no clue, simply clutching her folder tighter and sinking back into her seat. The man with the Rolex sneered faintly, whispering something about street wisdom not saving balance sheets, but she did not react, for her mother once told her, "When the eagle soars, the sparrows chatter. Let their noise not disturb your flight." So she let silence be her shield. Minutes later, Grace appeared again, announcing a short break before final deliberations, and the group spilled into the cafeteria where the smell of jollof rice, fried plantain, and coffee mingled in the air. The candidates lined up, some ordering meals with corporate cards, others boasting about travel experiences, while Ifeoma counted her coins and found them too few for food, so she bought only a small sachet of water and sat alone by the window, her folder on her lap like a loyal friend. Outside, the Lagos sky glowed with late afternoon heat, the traffic below crawling like ants, the honking and shouts muted by glass. She opened her notebook and began scribbling ideas for how to improve van schedules from the case study, not because anyone asked, but because her mind refused to sit idle. Across the room, the manicured woman filmed herself eating fried rice, practicing a gratitude video in case she won the role, while the man with glasses argued loudly over the phone about investment returns. Amid all this noise, Ifeoma noticed an elderly janitor struggling with an overloaded trash bag, the plastic straining, ready to burst. Instinctively, she rose, leaving her folder behind, and hurried over, knotting the bag tighter, steadying the bin, and sliding it back into place. "Thank you, my daughter," the janitor said softly, eyes widening at her kindness. "Most people step aside when they see me." She smiled faintly. The load is lighter when two hands carry it. She returned to her seat, unaware that across the cafeteria, Adewale himself had been watching from a shadowed corner, nursing a cup of coffee, testing not just her words in the interview, but her unguarded moments outside. And what he saw stirred something deeper than curiosity. It was recognition of a rare kind of spirit, the sort money could not purchase. Soon the candidates were summoned back upstairs, chatter resuming as they speculated about the outcome, but Ifeoma walked quietly, bare feet padding against marble, her sachet of water half empty, her mind rehearsing prayers rather than speeches. In the boardroom, tension sat like a coiled snake. Grace cleared her throat, ready to read the decision, when the door opened and Adewale stepped in fully, no longer hiding behind windows or corners, his presence shocking the candidates into silence. He did not sit at the head of the table, but stood at the center, his voice calm but commanding. "I have observed enough," he said, eyes sweeping the room, lingering on each polished face, before finally resting on Ifeoma. This company was not built by fine suits or rehearsed speeches. It was built on grit, on people who carried coolers through flooded roads, on minds that see solutions where others see only obstacles. Today, one among you reminded me of that truth. Murmurs rose, some hopeful, some bitter, but Adewale raised his hand for silence. "We have one role to fill, and the offer goes to," he paused, letting suspense stretch like taut string, "to Ifeoma no Koya." For a breath, the room went utterly still, as if even the air itself refused to move, and then gasps erupted. The manicured woman's jaw fell open. The Rolex man cursed under his breath. The man with glasses muttered about bias, but none dared speak loudly. Ifeoma sat frozen, unsure if her ears had betrayed her, until Grace repeated softly, "Congratulations, Ms. Mokoya," sliding an offer letter across the table. Ifeoma's hands trembled as she reached for it, her eyes filling though she fought to keep them steady. Adewale watched her, a small, unreadable smile touching his lips, remembering how she had once said, "Truth can wear dust, not diamonds." And now, here she was, dust and all, chosen in a room of diamonds, proving that character, not polish, writes the final line of destiny.
The announcement cracked the room like thunder, and though Grace's voice had been steady as she handed the offer letter across the table, the silence that followed felt heavier than any storm. Ifeoma sat stiff, her trembling hands clutching the document as though it might vanish if she blinked, while the other candidates shifted uneasily in their chairs, the weight of disappointment twisting their polished expressions into masks of disbelief and bitterness. The man with the Rolex slammed his pen against the table with a forced chuckle, muttering, "So this was a show all along, huh? A barefoot charity case wins while the rest of us waste our suits?" But Adewale's eyes cut to him with the precision of a blade, silencing his protest without a single word, for the chief's presence needed no raised voice, only the quiet authority of a man accustomed to obedience. The manicured woman leaned back with a hiss of disdain, whispering to her neighbor, "They'll regret this experiment in 2 weeks." But her words hung limp in the air, for even those who envied Ifeoma could not erase the memory of her map, her clarity, her quiet dignity that outshone their noise. Mr. Okonkwo from finance cleared his throat sharply, daring to break the tension. "Chief Adewale, with respect, she lacks corporate experience. How can she manage the scale of operations we face?" And Adewale's reply came low, deliberate, carrying the weight of finality. "Because she speaks from reality, not theory, and reality feeds the people, while theory feeds only egos. I did not build this company by listening only to those who wore shoes polished with imported wax. I built it by trusting those who carried mud on their feet, but vision in their eyes." And his gaze shifted back to Ifeoma, who lowered her head in gratitude,
her voice faint yet steady. "Thank you, sir. I will not waste this chance." Grace dismissed the candidates, and as they filed out, some shooting daggers of envy, others already composing excuses for their failure, Ifeoma remained seated, still dazed, her folder pressed to her lap as though it were a lifeline. Adewale lingered behind, waiting until the last door closed, then crossed the room slowly, his footsteps measured, his eyes never leaving hers. "You do not need to thank me yet," he said, his voice softer now, almost private. "This letter is not a gift, it is a responsibility. What you do with it will define you, not the paper itself." And she nodded, clutching the letter tighter, whispering, "I understand, sir. My mother used to say, the yam that grows in secret will show itself when the leaves spread. I only pray my leaves do not fail." Something in her words unsettled him, reminding him of the roadside that morning, the engine belt she had diagnosed, the quiet confidence that had pierced his armor of pride. And he realized that every moment since had been shaping a story larger than any one decision. When she finally rose to leave, her bare feet making no sound on the marble floor, Grace moved to escort her, but Adewale raised his hand gently, let her go on her own. And he watched as the girl who had entered his tower, dusty and mocked, now walked out with her head higher than before, a faint glow of destiny trailing her steps. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed Broad Street in molten gold, the traffic roaring, hawkers calling, but Ifeoma barely heard them, her eyes wet with unshed tears as she clutched the letter to her chest, whispering to her mother's memory, "Mama, I made it. Even without shoes, I made it." And strangers passing by did not know her story, but turned their heads at the sight of a barefoot girl smiling through tears, as if light itself had chosen her. Inside the tower, Adewale returned to his office, staring out over Lagos, his reflection in the glass troubled yet alive, and he murmured to himself, "Perhaps wealth is not tested by how many towers I raise, but how many feet I lift from dust."
Evening draped its velvet cloak over Lagos as the city's neon lights blinked awake one by one, and in the penthouse office of Kato Holdings Tower, Adewale stood alone before the massive window, the glass reflecting both the skyline and the storm within him. For though the decision had been made and the offer letter given, his mind wrestled with unease, not because he doubted Ifeoma's worth, but because her very presence exposed truths he had long buried. All his life he had been surrounded by ambition disguised as loyalty, yet here was a barefoot woman who asked for nothing but a chance to serve, and that unsettled him more than deceit ever had. Behind him, the heavy doors creaked open, and Grace entered cautiously, clutching her clipboard as though it were a shield, her voice careful but edged with frustration. "Sir, with respect, the board will question today's outcome. They expected a candidate with degrees from London or Lagos Business School, not a girl with dust on her feet." Adewale turned, his eyes sharp. "Let them question. When has the board ever carried medicine to the villages? When have they ever stood on muddy roads at dawn?" Grace hesitated, biting back further protest, for she had seen the look in his eyes before, the look of a man who would not be swayed once conviction had rooted. That same night, in a cramped one-room apartment in Surulere, Ifeoma sat cross-legged on a thin mattress, the offer letter spread before her like scripture, her younger brother Chidi peering at it with wide eyes, asking, "Sister, does this mean we can finally fix Mama's sewing machine?" And she laughed softly, brushing his hair back. "It means we can fix more than that, Chidi. It means maybe, just maybe, the world will see us." Though in her heart, she wondered if the world would ever let someone like her stay seen. News traveled faster than fire on dry harmattan grass. By morning, whispers raced across the tower's corridors that the new hire was a barefoot girl who had shamed polished candidates. And while some laughed at the scandal, others shook their heads in disbelief. Yet among the junior staff, the janitors, the cleaners, the drivers, a quiet pride bloomed, for one of their own had crossed the glass barrier. Meanwhile, Adewale summoned a small circle of executives to his private dining hall, their suits dark as their skepticism, their voices rising in objection. "Chief, this is reckless. How will shareholders react?" one demanded, while another sneered. "She will embarrass us in front of partners.
Imagine bringing her to Abuja or Port Harcourt summits barefoot. Adewale's palm slammed the table, the sound like thunder silencing the room, his words clipped with fury. Better barefoot honesty than polished deceit. If this company cannot stomach truth, then it is not worth the empire I built. And silence hung heavy after his declaration. Days passed and Ifeoma reported for duty, now in simple but decent flats, gifted discreetly by a female clerk moved by her story, yet she still walked with the same grounded grace, carrying notebooks instead of tablets, asking questions instead of pretending to know answers. Some colleagues mocked her in whispers, others tested her with impossible tasks, but each time she responded with clarity and humility, never raising her voice, never shrinking either. Adewale watched quietly from afar, his eyes catching details others ignored. The way she greeted security guards by name, the way she stayed late to understand data she'd never seen before, the way she paused by the lobby's cleaning staff to ask about their families. One late evening, as he left the building, he saw her at the bus stop, standing under a flickering streetlight with her folder hugged tight, waiting for a Danfo bus while rain threatened above. Something inside him rebelled at the sight, for it felt wrong that the woman who had revived his engine and his faith should stand vulnerable in the chaos of Lagos night. And before he knew it, he had ordered his driver to stop, lowering his tinted window, calling softly, "Ifeoma, get in." She hesitated, surprised, wary of crossing invisible lines, but he added, "It is not a command, it is a request, from one who knows what it means to walk barefoot on burning ground." Slowly she climbed in, the leather seats cool beneath her, the city burring past as the car sped on. For a long moment they rode in silence. Then he asked, voice low, "Do you know why I chose you?" And she shook her head, whispering, "I only know that you saw me when others laughed." His gaze lingered on her reflection in the window. "No, Ifeoma, I did not see you. I saw myself, the boy I once was before wealth caged me. You reminded me of that boy, and perhaps of the man I am still trying to be." Her breath caught, her heart pounding, and in that fragile silence a bridge formed between dust and diamonds, not of romance yet, but of recognition, of two souls discovering that truth, when spoken without fear, has the power to disarm even the proudest hearts.
Weeks melted into months, and the once scandalous appointment of the barefoot girl became the heartbeat of Cato Holdings' operations. For where others chased prestige, Ifeoma chased solutions, spending Thursdays in the field with drivers and nurses, listening to mothers in dusty courtyards, scribbling notes in her battered notebook while colleagues in pressed suits stayed behind polishing PowerPoints. And slowly, her results began to silence the whispers. Vaccine wastage fell, outreach doubled, and communities once forgotten began to chant her name with gratitude. Yet even as her influence grew, she never forgot the bus stop under the flickering light, never traded humility for status, for she carried her mother's voice always. The yam that grows in secret will one day spread its leaves, but it must never forget its roots. Inside the tower, Adewale found himself drawn not just to her numbers, but to her spirit, watching how she greeted the receptionist with the same warmth she showed the board, how she wrote every report by hand first before transferring to a screen, how she insisted that success be measured not by applause, but by impact. And he realized that in choosing her, he had unwittingly chosen to confront his own emptiness. For the first time in years, dinners at his mansion were no longer lonely banquets served in silence. Sometimes Ifeoma joined, hesitant at first, sitting on the edge of her chair as though unworthy. But over time, laughter crept in, shared stories replaced awkward pauses, and one evening, as rain drummed the roof, Adewale admitted softly, "You remind me of my mother, the only person who ever told me to build more than walls." And Ifeoma, eyes glistening, replied, "Then let us build people, sir, for walls without people are tombs." The next morning, news broke across business dailies. Billionaire partners with barefoot girl to launch community initiative. The headline mocking yet magnetic, but Adewale ignored it, choosing instead to stand beside Ifeoma at a press conference where she, in her modest cream blouse, announced the Cato Human Dignity Project, a foundation to fund rural clinics,
education for orphans and small businesses for widows, her voice shaking yet strong as she declared, "Greatness is not in what we keep, but in what we give." And the room fell silent, reporters scribbling furiously, as though history had entered unnoticed. Back at the mansion, changes bloomed. The dining hall, once echoing with emptiness, now buzzed with neighbors invited for meals. A wing of the estate converted into classrooms for children of staff. And Adewale's garden sprouted with herbs and vegetables planted by Ifeoma herself, who laughed when he tried to help, teasing, "Chief, you are better with contracts than hoes." And he grinned, replying, "Then teach me, for even the rich must learn to kneel before the soil." As seasons turned, respect blossomed into something deeper. Nights of quiet conversation stretched longer, silences grew warmer, and in time Adewale found himself confessing truths he had never shared, that wealth had caged him, that love had always felt like a transaction, until she arrived barefoot into his tower and broke the spell. And Ifeoma, trembling, admitted that she still feared she did not belong in his world, to which he answered with a proverb of his own, "The moon does not ask permission to shine beside the stars." Years later, at a celebration in Abuja, where the foundation unveiled its largest rural hospital, Adewale stood on stage beside her, not introducing her as an employee, but as his partner in both life and mission. The crowd erupting as he told the story of the barefoot girl who taught him that truth wears dust, not diamonds. And in the quiet after applause, he turned to her and whispered, "You gave me back my home." And she pressed his hand, whispering, "And you gave me what I thought I could never have, purpose with love." That night, back in the mansion, now transformed into a living home filled with laughter and children's footsteps, Ifeoma tucked a small boy into bed, her brother Chidi, grown strong and studying by lamplight, and whispered the same story she would later tell her own children, of a morning when her sandal broke, when the world mocked, when pride sneered, yet destiny opened its door. And as Adewale listened from the hallway, tears glinting in his eyes, he knew that empires would rise and fall, but the true wealth he would leave behind was not in towers or contracts, but in the echo of that tale passed down, of a poor lady's barefoot interview, of a choice that shocked a nation, and of a love and legacy built not on gold, but on dust made holy by truth.